So this is disagreement about the Stamp Act that's very profound. And this, I've argued, is crucial to understanding the revolution, because it's kind of the unresolved issue. Who, in fact, has the right to tax in the colonies? And this argument boils down to the phrase virtual versus actual representation. In other words, there are two different understandings about what representation actually means, and who, therefore, has the right to tax Americans. So I want to explain that to you, and I'm going to do it through a couple of quotations that get to the heart of the matter. The first one's from the Providence, Rhode Island Gazette in May of 1765, talking about why it thinks the Stamp Act is illegal. To infer, my lord, that the British members of Parliament actually represent the colonies, who are not permitted to do the least towards their own appointment, because Britain is unequally represented. I want to explain again that Parliament's this ancient institution. Not everybody gets the same vote. A lot of people don't get to vote. Sometimes people represent enormous districts. Sometimes they represent only 50 voters. So it's a very uneven representation. We'll explain that when we quote the British side of this argument. In fact, actually, I'm going to quote the British side of the argument first, because it makes the American side a lot more comprehensible. So this is from a British politician named Thomas Whately, writing in 1765. The fact is that the inhabitants of the colonies are represented in Parliament. They do not indeed choose the members of that assembly, neither are 9/10 of the people voters. For the right of election is annexed to certain species of property. You have to be a property holder to vote, to peculiar franchises, and to inhabitancy in some particular places. But these descriptions comprehend only a very small part of the land, the property, and the people of this island. The colonies are in exactly the same situation. All British subjects are really in the same. None are actually, all are virtually represented in Parliament. For every member of Parliament sits in the House not as representative of his own constituents, but as one of that august assembly by which all the common people of Great Britain are represented. So Parliament sits as a body to represent the people as a body. Parliament as a group decides, the House of Commons that is, decides what should be done for common people. So you don't directly vote for a representative in Congress, and he doesn't directly represent you as a voter for him. He represents, with his fellows, the ideas of all commoners. So you don't have to exactly have voted for someone to be represented. As long as you're a commoner, you're represented by the House of Commons. And that, says Parliament, applies to Americans as well. They're represented even though they don't vote for someone. And what's going on is that Americans don't really understand how Parliament works. Okay, now let's get to the American response from the Providence Gazette. To infer, my lord, that the British members of Parliament actually represent the colonies, who are not permitted to do the least act toward their appointment, because Britain is unequally represented, although every man in the kingdom with certain legal qualifications can vote for someone to represent him, is such a piece of sophistry that I had half a mind to bypass the cobweb without blowing it to pieces. Is there no difference between a country's having a privilege to choose 558 members to represent them in Parliament, though on unequal proportions in several districts, and not having the liberty to choose any? To turn the tables, if Americans only had leave to send members to Parliament, could such sophistry ever persuade the people of Britain that they were represented and had a share in the national councils? Or suppose none of the 558 members were chosen by the people, but enjoyed the right of sitting in Parliament by hereditary descent. Could the common people be said to share in the national councils? How trifling, then, is the supposition that we in America virtually have such share in the national constitutions by those members whom we never chose. If we are not their constituents, they are not our representatives. A representative, from the American point of view, is someone for whom you vote, someone for whom you are a constituent. There's no other definition of a representative. And this seems as a kind of philosophical dispute, but it's really a dispute about power. Who should run a government? Who should tax? The American response to the Stamp Act is that we really only have should be taxed by our own directly elected representatives. So what you heard in 4th grade, that the American Revolution is about no taxation without representation, is largely true. It's the question of who's a representative and which body is the true representative of the common people and has the right to tax them. Here's a cartoon about virtual representation. And we see Britannia on the right, the woman on the right carrying the spear and the shield, who's about to stumble into a pit while Americans suffer unjust taxation. Okay, so that's the situation in 1765, and the Congress, after all of these riots and everything in America, repeals the Stamp Act, and you'd think maybe it's over, but Parliament has, even though they can repeal a particular act, they can't repeal the right to tax, or they'll never get any money at all from the American colonies. So when they passed the repeal of the Stamp Act, they also passed something called the Declaratory Act, which declares that parliamentary laws bind the colonies, quote, in all cases whatsoever. We, in other words, have the right to tax you, and we're going to return to that. And they do return to it. They return to it in 1767. A new prime minister comes in, William Pitt, in 1766. He realizes the government's still broke. He realizes the American colonies still aren't paying for themselves. And he says, well, this is something that's got to end. And it's his Chancellor of the Exchequer, his Secretary of the Treasury, who names Townsend. And he proposes a new set of taxes for America that become known as the Townsend duties. Now, the Townsend duties get around this problem of internal taxation. They say, okay, the colonists have agreed that Parliament has the right to tax, have customs duties. So we're just going to tax more heavily the goods coming in and out of the American colonies, and they can't raise a fuss because, you know, we don't have the right to do that. So the Townsend duties tax all sorts of, or set duties on, I should say, all sorts of goods coming in or out of the colonies. Glass, lead, paint, paper, tea, anything that's got to be imported, they tax. And they say, look, you can't object to it the way you did about the Stamp Act. But Americans do. Americans object to that. There are all sorts of complaints about it. There are all sorts of complaints about British oppression. Here are some troops landing in Boston in 1768. And in March of 1770 is the Boston Massacre. There's this riot. Some troops are attacked in front of the State House. They respond by firing into the crowd, and 5 people are killed, and the soldiers put on trial. They're defended, by the way, by John Adams, who's later a revolutionary and president of the United States. There are all sorts of problems caused by the Townsend duties. So this resistance to taxation, it's particularly strong in New England, is not going away. So Parliament responds in 1770 by repealing the Townsend duties, except for the tax on tea. Americans still aren't happy about that. There's the old State House where the Boston Massacre is. And there's the grave of the victims of the Boston Massacre. I'm going to skip Peter Oliver and talk about tea again. Okay. A lady's adieu to her tea table, 1773. This is in response to the Tea Act. The Townsend duty had left on tea. Americans are very resistant to that. They won't pay that tax, and there's a boycott of tea. In 1773, Parliament passes the Tea Act. Like the Sugar Act, the Tea Act is an attempt to rationalize an international trade. The British East India Company is in serious financial trouble. The taxes on tea aren't being collected. So once again, they try to rationalize the system by lowering the tax. So the tea tax will be very low. It's a very common commodity. Everybody loves tea. It'll be a good revenue raiser, and it will save the East India Company, and it's fair that Americans should pay it as well. But Americans don't think that way. Here's a poem, A Lady's Adieu to Her Tea Table. Farewell the tea board with your gaudy attire, ye cups and ye saucers that I did admire. To my cream pot and tongs I now bid adieu, that pleasure's all fled that I once found in you. Farewell, pretty chest that so lately did shine with different types of tea, Hyson and Congo and best double fine. Many a sweet moment by you I have sat, hearing girls and old maids to tattle and chat. And it goes on like this. But no more shall my teapot so generous be in filling the cups with this pernicious tea. For I'll fill it with water and drink the same, before I'll lose liberty, that dearest name. So Americans believe it's a question of their freedom that they resist the tax on tea. Why do they believe that? They believe it because they see the Tea Act as a kind of entering wedge, as the camel's nose under the tent. If they pay the tea tax, then more taxes will follow, and they'll give up their right to their own representation. So this is not just a question of paying some tax you don't like, it's a question of liberty itself. And the refusal to pay the tea tax leads to the Boston Tea Party. There are some ships full of tea in Boston Harbor. They can't be unloaded until somebody pays the tax on them. That's refused. The ships aren't going to go anywhere until they're unloaded, so they sit. And this standoff leads to the Boston Tea Party, where the Sons of Liberty go onto the ships and toss the tea. And the response to the Boston Tea Party is that Parliament finally loses patience with Boston and Massachusetts in particular, and acts strongly. As soon as Parliament hears about the Boston Tea Party, they pass what becomes known as the Coercive Acts. The Boston Port Bill closes the Port of Boston until the tax is paid on the tea that's been destroyed. The Massachusetts Government Act suspends the legislature of Massachusetts from governing the colony. The Administration of Justice Act makes sure that soldiers can't be tried for their actions in a colony the way they had in the Boston Massacre. And they also assert the right to quarter soldiers anywhere they want in the colonies. So here we see poor Massachusetts being force-fed tea, being molested, while justice cries in the background, or Britannia cries in the background. By this point, we see that the American Revolution is coming. Here's a Sons of Liberty cartoon. We have the Boston Tea Party in the background. We have the taxman being tarred and feathered with a rope around his neck, threatening with lynching. We see in the background the Liberty Tree with the Stamp Act upside down upon it. The American Revolution is coming, and there's not much that can be done to stop it. Okay, so I've given you this explanation for the American Revolution that has to do with theories of representation, and it has to do with a lot of ideological arguments. And I want to end with a quotation from a revolutionary about why he was part of the American Revolution. And he denies a lot of knowledge about these sorts of arguments and theories of representation and all that. So why is he a revolutionary? This is an interview in 1827 with a 91-year-old veteran of the Battle of Lexington and Concord, who is named Captain Levi Preston. And his interviewer is obviously much younger, and he wants to understand what happened in the Revolution over 50 years before. Question: Captain Preston, why did you go to the Concord fight the 19th of April, 1775? Answer: why did I go? Yes. My histories tell me that you men of the Revolution took up arms against intolerable oppressions. What were they? Oppressions? I didn't feel them. British government wasn't that oppressive. What? You were not oppressed by the Stamp Act? I never saw one of those stamps, and always understood that the governor put them away. I'm certain I never paid a penny for any one of them. Well then, what about the tea tax? Tea tax? I never drank a drop of the stuff. The boys threw it all overboard. Then I suppose you've been reading Harrington or Sidney and Locke about the eternal principles of liberty. In other words, you've been reading British political philosophy. Never heard of them. We only read the Bible, the Catechism, Watt's Psalms, and the hymns and the almanac. He's a good Puritan. He doesn't read anything but religious stuff except his almanac. Well then, what was the matter? And what did you mean in going to the fight? So here's the answer. Young man, what we meant in going for those redcoats was this. We had always governed ourselves, and we always meant to. They didn't mean that we should. So there's a complex explanation for the American Revolution, but I think that's the simple one. We'd always governed ourselves. Americans had gotten used to self-government in the century before the American Revolution. They'd gotten used to questioning and undermining authority since the Great Awakening. And they meant to keep on going the way they did. They saw the actions of Parliament to raise more money as interference in self-government rather than new oppression. And that led to the American Revolution. Thanks.